I recorded it. Okay. So we are going to go through the one step today. And feel free to stop me at any time and ask any questions about how to fill this out. I will preface this conversation this morning with three other managing brokers and myself are working right now on some changes to the one step. So there are a few things in here that I might mention are subject to change. Those changes are probably coming, they're definitely coming before September, but it kind of depends on how fast we can get approval on all the changes we have. So last week, the managing brokers met and we made about 7 or 8 changes to this contract. So we have to run those through some different attorney channels and everything before we can make it official, but know that there may be a few small changes coming to this. So I might mention those as we go. I'm going to screen share. If I look like I'm looking over here, it's because this is where my contract is on the other screen. So don't think I'm not looking at you guys. I'm just looking at my other screen. Okay. Here is the one. So this is what I want you guys to be using for everything other than new construction. So this contract doesn't work for new construction because for new construction, you're going under contract before there's a structure. And so some of the things in this contract aren't applicable to new construction. And so in that case, we use what's called a purchase agreement. And the purchase agreement is just kind of like a letter of intent, if you're familiar with that. The purchase agreement triggers a formal contract. So all builders will have their own contract that they want to use that will include some language about their warranty and things like that. So for new construction, you'll use a purchase agreement. And I don't even train on purchase agreements because they're pretty rare and I really don't like them. This is the contract you're going to want to use for everything existing. This is a residential sales contract. So if you do anything in the commercial realm, you are not going to want to use this contract. Land sales, actually, Liz, that's funny that you ask that. Land sales would be a purchase agreement as of right now, but we are working on a land sale contract. It'll probably come out. This is April. I'm going to say by July, we'll have a land sale contract that'll work on anything from a residential lot, a commercial lot, farm ground, rec land, anything like that. So that'll come out, like I said, sometime in the next few months. But for right now, it's purchase agreement. Okay. So let's get started. Some of the things I'm going to teach you are absolute. This is how it has to be filled out. Some of the things that I'm going to teach you are the preference of managing brokers and also just kind of consideration of other agents. So the first thing is the top part of this contract. Fill out as much of this as you possibly can. There's nothing more frustrating as an agent than getting an offer and all of this being blank except maybe your client's name and the agent name. So the seller's name can be found on the tax assessor's website. So go in and find the seller's name, and there's a direct link in MRED to the tax assessor's site, so you don't even have to leave the MLS. It'll reroute you straight from MRED. If you need help finding that, just let me know. But you'll fill in the seller's name, their address, which is likely the address of the house you're putting an offer in on if it's owner occupied. You won't know the seller's attorney yet. Very rarely would you know that beforehand. Maybe if you've had conversation with the listing agent as you've been showing the property, maybe they mentioned it, but most of the time you don't know the seller's attorney, so you can leave that blank. The listing office will be the office of the listing agent, so Keller Williams, Remax, Coldwell Banker. And then the listing agent name goes here. Their license number you can put in here. If you don't have their license number, that's an okay thing to let them fill out. And then their contact information. You will not have the current mortgage holder, so it's okay to leave that one blank. The HOA contact you may or may not have. Not all subdivisions have a homeowners association, so You may not have that. It's okay if you need to leave that blank. The MLS listing number is the listing number in MRED at the top of the screen. It'll say MLS number. And then you'll have your buyer's information, you know, your buyer's address. If your buyer is going to use an attorney, you can go ahead and put that in here. Your buyer doesn't have to use an attorney. So legally speaking, your buyer or your seller do not have to have an attorney. In Bloomington, we are conditioned to tell our sellers that they have to hire an attorney. Legally, they don't have to. That's just customary in Bloomington. So if you do have a seller that says, hey, I've sold 6 houses in my past lives and I've never used an attorney, I don't want to use one. We do have to give them that option. You can share with them the benefits of having an attorney, that we are not attorneys, we can't practice law. So an attorney will help them in a way that we can't. So you can share the value, but we can't force them to use an attorney. I'm teaching a class right now. Sorry, sick kid. But the buyers are probably 50-50 in our market about whether or not they use an attorney. So if the buyer would like to have an attorney, you can put that here. If they don't want to have an attorney, that's okay too. And then the selling office, this is always a little bit confusing. The selling office is the buyer's agent's office. So a lot of people get confused that the selling office is the listing office. Listing and selling are the two sides of the transaction. So listing office has the listing, selling office has the buyer. So our office name goes here. Your name as the agent goes here. Both of our license numbers go here. If you ever forget what our license number is as an office, you can find it on kwrevolutionaries.com, and there's a little tab for office information, and a bunch of our license information is there if you ever forget it. And then your phone number and email address. So fill out as much of this as possible. This top part is what the title company uses to get and the lender use to get the transaction started after it goes under contract. And if it doesn't get filled out early, it tends to not get filled out. So fill out as much of that top part as you can. All right, then we get into the offer. So in here, make sure nobody's said anything in the chat. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to just unmute or stop me. Okay, offer and acceptance. So this is the date that you're asking for a response by. Given the funky market that we're in, this time period is getting shorter and shorter. So when you submit the offer, let's say it's 9/10 right now. If I'm submitting an offer at 9/10, the date I put in here is the date I want the listing agent to respond to me by, whether they're accepting, declining, or sending me a counteroffer. If it was 9 o'clock right now, I would probably ask for a response within 2 hours. Now, know that in the seller's market we're in, there's a very good chance that the listing agent comes back and says, yeah, we're looking at all offers at 5 o'clock, or hey, I can't get a hold of him right now. I can't talk to him until 3 o'clock this afternoon, so you're going to have to wait. That's just the market we're in. Sellers have all the power right now. So it's always worth an ask to try to get a shorter time so that you lock it in for your buyer client. But know that unfortunately we may not get an answer as fast as we'd like. And then number 2, this agreement is entered into between your seller's name goes here and your buyer's names go here, and it references that right here between your seller and your buyer. Number 3, the legal description, price, and payment. So the legal description will go in here. There are 3 ways that we reference a property: PIN number, legal description, and street address. The reason that we put all 3 of those on the contract is because if you were to transpose 2 numbers, we at least have 3 ways to identify the property. So if one of them is wrong, we still have 2 others. So that title work doesn't get ordered on the wrong property. If you only fill out 2 of the 3 and you transpose a number, then the title company doesn't know which one is correct, and it may hold up their process. So always fill out all 3 of these. You can find the legal description on the tax assessor's site if it's not in the MLS. The PIN number is a required field in the MLS, so it will always be there. And then the street address goes here. So your legal description, if it's in town, can be as simple as lot 23 Eagle View Estates subdivision. Sometimes if it's a rural property, it gets into those meets and bounds that you learned in your class, the southwest corner of the blah, blah, blah. So the legal description can get long depending on where it's at, but a lot of times in town, it's just lot number and subdivision name. And then your PIN number is that, 12-digit number that has all the dashes in it. And then commonly known as is your street address in whatever town, Illinois, zip code. Buyer agrees to pay the total sum of, here's your purchase price, and it reminds you of that in parentheses here. And in the manner following, buyer has paid, here's your earnest money in the first blank. People get confused about this. This second blank is only used if your client is paying earnest money in 2 deposits. So sometimes if they agree to put down $10,000 in earnest money, but they have to move some money around, they may put down $5,000 now and $5,000 in 2 days. It's not very common, but it does happen sometimes. So if that were the case, you would put $5,000 here and then on or before Wednesday, an additional sum of $5,000. If they're only putting down one earnest deposit, which 95% of the time is the case, you would put $10,000 here, and then you would just put NA in these blanks. So, or you can just put 0 in this blank so that everybody knows there's not any more money. We don't want to leave any blanks in this contract because what could happen is everybody signs this, dots I's, crosses T's, and then this is left blank and somebody comes in to that second earnest money blank and writes another $5,000 and nobody knows that it wasn't part of the original contract. Where if you've put a dash or NA or 0 or something in there, then nobody can go back and modify it after it's been signed. And then to be deposited into the escrow account of blank until closing. Traditionally, this is the listing office. So normally, like if Keller Williams is the listing office, we'll hold the earnest money. But that being said, right now, if you want to hold the earnest money for example, Coldwell Banker doesn't take electronic earnest money. So if you wanted Keller Williams to hold the earnest money because your clients are out of town and they need to send it electronically, you could put Keller Williams in here to hold escrow even though we're not the listing office. So traditionally it is the listing office. There are a couple brokerages in town that don't hold earnest money. So make sure you read broker remarks. They usually put that in the broker remarks, and then it would just be held by us or by a title company. It really doesn't matter who holds the earnest money because legally I can't release it until all parties have signed or a judge has ordered me to release it to one party. So sometimes people get funny about holding earnest money at an office that isn't theirs, but really it doesn't matter because we're all bound by the same escrow laws. So don't ever get worried about that. And then the remainder to be required by the closing agent on or before, here's your closing date. Make sure you have your client's initial at the bottom of every page. The next is deed in possession. In most of the state of Illinois and specifically in McLean County, we do deed in possession at closing. So in some markets, you may get possession and you may close on it at a different time that you get possession. So deed and possession may not go hand in hand. For example, my parents sold a house in Indianapolis and they closed on, let's say today, but the buyers didn't take occupancy until the middle of May. And so my parents had to keep homeowners insurance and utilities and all of that until middle of May. So in our market, we do deed and possession at the same time. So this would be your closing date. Sometimes, especially in this market, we're doing leasebacks or early occupancy agreements or something like that. That is a separate document. So if your client is taking possession at a date other than the closing date, I would still put deed in possession in here as the closing date and then use an early occupancy agreement because there's a lot more stipulations in that agreement. And if you ever need that form, let me know, but it's in .loop and DocuSign. So this will just be your closing date. Your taxes. Taxes are prorated through the day before closing. So if I'm closing today, say I'm the buyer, I'm closing today, I am paying taxes for the entire day today. So I may be closing at 4 o'clock today, but I'm paying taxes for the whole day. They prorate it to the day, not the hour. So They're prorated through the date before closing. Sometimes what happens, your taxes are based on your most recent assessment. But sometimes your house will get reassessed, and then the buyer will say, I got this big tax bill and I didn't get enough money on the settlement sheet from the seller because you pay your taxes in arrears. So what we're paying in 2022 is for living in the house in 2021. Well, the seller was living in the house in 2021, right? So they give the buyer a credit and say, here's what you're going to have to pay for taxes next year. Well, let's say the house gets reassessed and taxes go up $1,000. The buyer can go back to the seller and say, I got the tax bill and my credit amount was off by more than $100. And the seller will have to pay the buyer that difference. Or vice versa. If the seller decides to watch the tax assessments and says, hey, I see that our tax bill went down, that almost never happens. I want a credit back, then the seller could get money back, but it's usually in the buyer's favor. I've never seen it go the other way. As an agent, you don't have to get involved in this tax proration other than sending it along to the attorneys. So say you closed on a house last year and you're getting an email from the buyer this year saying, hey, I got this tax bill. What do I do with it? I didn't get enough money from the seller. All you have to do as the agent is send it to the title company that did the settlement sheet, and they will figure out the prorations, and they'll usually send out the communication. They may send it back to you to forward along, but they'll do all of your calculations. You don't have to do that. Encumbrances. These two items just state that first, if there's a mortgage, the mortgage has to be satisfied. So your buyer client can't purchase a property where the mortgage is not paid off. So the seller is agreeing that any mortgages on the property will be paid off. And then that any easements, let's say there's a utility easement or something like that on the property that's going to have to transfer with it. That's outside of the seller's control. So they're not going to be able to change any easements like that. This also states, let's say your seller put a fence on the other property. So if your property line is here, your seller lives here, and they put their fence over here, they will have to satisfy that. They will have to move their fence if it becomes a problem on their dime before closing. So they are just saying that they have lived in accordance with any easements and any property boundaries. Otherwise, it's on them to fix it. Personal property, this gets really, really messy. This is one of the changes that's coming in the contract is we're trying to figure out how to clean up personal property. Be very careful. Don't start writing in a bunch of crazy things in here like furniture and pool tables and things like that because the bank doesn't like it. Stick pretty close to what's here. Sometimes there's like 2 refrigerators, so you may check refrigerator and put in other garage refrigerator. So you may need to clean up something like that. So we're looking at maybe giving the option for like writing in 2 refrigerators or the number of dishwashers, because sometimes if you have a bar in the basement, it might have a dishwasher with it. So we're working on a little bit more clarity here. But you'll want to check the boxes here for everything that your buyer client wants. It will be listed in the MLS on personal property. If appliances are listed, they're assumed to stay with the house. They still have to be marked on here. If they're in the MLS, but they're not on the contract, the seller does not have to leave them because you didn't negotiate them into the contract. So make sure. Also, one comment with television wall mounts. I've had a couple of issues where television wall mounts did not sell with the house. And so the seller took them off and left gaping holes in the wall. They are not contractually obligated to fill those holes. So if there is a television wall mount that they're not leaving, you may want to write, and I'll show you where you can write that, that they repair the drywall behind the wall mount. I had one that didn't close because somebody didn't patch holes for the TV mounts. So just be mindful of that. Financing. This is the part everybody gets wrong. So if you have a pre-approval letter, you should always have a pre-approval letter from your buyer client. Sometimes all of this information isn't on the pre-approval, especially if the lender provided the pre-approval letter on a Saturday afternoon. Sometimes they're just vague and they're just trying to get you something to send in with the offer. But we really have to know all of these things. So if you haven't seen our Mortgage 101 class, take that, and the Mortgage 101 class explains all of these mortgages, so I'm not going to go into that today. But you need to know if it's conventional, VA, FHA, IDA, USDA, or RD. That's really important right now, especially in this market. So one of these has to be checked. We need to know if it's an adjustable rate or a fixed rate at an interest rate or financing in an amount equal to blank percent of the purchase price. This is the financed amount. So if they're putting 20% down, you're writing 80% here. This is what almost everybody seems to get wrong. Make sure you read through this. So this is an adjustable rate or fixed interest rate financing in an amount equal to blank percent of the purchase price amortized over 15, 20, 30 years. So make sure you're not putting 20% here. If they're putting 20% down, you would put 80% here. That's the most common thing I would say people mess up on this contract. And then at an interest rate not to exceed, in order to know this percentage, you probably have to have a conversation with the lender. So there will hopefully be a percentage on your pre-approval letter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if rates go up, they can't afford the house. So I usually, best practice, I mark at prevailing loan interest rates and terms. If you know that, hey, they're at the top of their budget, interest rates are 5.5%, and if it goes up to 5.525, they're out, then you want to write 5% here because they're going to need that out. But if they've got some room, I usually just say at prevailing interest rate and terms. Also, if you are going to do that, make sure that their pre-approval letter is not 60 days old. Interest rates are changing so fast right now that if you don't have a pre-approval letter from within the last 2 or 3 weeks, I would probably go get another one because they had a big hike a couple weeks ago. So all the mortgage lenders are well aware that rates are changing so fast. They're updating pre-approvals hourly. So they'll be able to get that to you easily. If you hear a bunch of hacking in the background, I apologize. Kanan is just coughing up a lung right now. And then seller agrees to pay up to a certain amount in discount points. We don't see a lot of this right now. The lender will tell you if they're paying any discount points. However, we do see that the seller agrees to pay this much of buyer's closing costs. In this market, it's really hard to get closing costs paid, but if your client doesn't have a lot of cash to bring to closing, then your buyer client, then they may need the seller to pay for some closing costs. So you'll want to check with the lender and make sure that you know whether or not closing costs have to be paid or if you can negotiate them out, because sometimes your client just may not have the cash. And then buyer agrees to make a good faith effort to apply for said financing on or before. I do 3 to 4 business days after you write the contract. It sounds really fancy to say good faith effort to apply for said financing. Apply means send this executed contract to the lender. It just means that you're letting the lender know, hey, we wrote a contract, I bought this house, start the underwriting process. So they've already filled out their mortgage application when they got their pre-approval letter. This is not asking for that. This is asking for them to actually send the contract to the lender. You as the agent should do that. I would love to rely on our clients, but sometimes they get so excited that they bought a house that they go out and start looking at paint colors and furniture and forget that their lender needs a copy of the contract. So I would make that part of your routine, that as soon as the contract is executed, I'd rather the lender get it from you and the buyer client than not get it from either of you. So I make this 3 to 4 business days from the signing of the contract. In the event buyer is unable to obtain this financing, and buyer so notifies seller in writing on or before 1 week prior to closing. So this means the appraisal is done, all contingencies have been satisfied, that we have the clear to close is what we call it. So it's really hard to get the clear to close a whole week before closing, depending on how tight your contract date is. But you should know a week prior to closing if there's any problems. You may be waiting on some final numbers, but your lender should be able to tell you, yes, we're good to go. We're waiting on, a final mortgage payoff figure or something like that. But this means if for some reason your client goes out and buys a brand new Yukon 2 days before closing and they no longer qualify for their mortgage, they don't have an out on their contract because their financing deadline already passed. So if they went out and bought something, or they had some issue that came up in the title process that nobody knew about, whatever happens, that causes them to no longer qualify for their loan, that date and that blank is their out to get their earnest money back and walk away. So this is a very important date. This is a date you want to save in your phone, and you better make sure everybody's on the same page on the date in that blank. Appraisal. I would set the appraisal at least 3 weeks after the contract is signed, up to 1 week before closing. So anywhere in that gap, this is the date that the appraisal comes back, that you as the buyer's agent can say, hey, the house didn't appraise, we need to renegotiate, if you wrote the contract up like that. Or, hey, house appraised, we're all good, no issues. So this is your appraisal deadline. If the appraisal deadline is today and you didn't request an extension, and all an extension is an email to the listing agent saying, hey, we don't have the appraisal back, I'm requesting an extension for Thursday. That's as fancy as it gets. If you miss this deadline and you get the appraisal back on Thursday and say, hey, we have a problem, it didn't appraise, the listing agent can come back and say, yeah, you're past your deadline. So your buyers could have to forfeit their earnest money if they can't qualify. They might be able to get out on a financing deadline issue up here, but you're in some gray area and the attorneys would probably duke it out. Termites. Everybody hates this part. If you've had anything with active termites, it sucks, it scares everybody, and it gets really messy really fast. So in general, I would read this paragraph 5 times and make sure that you understand what this means. But this says that seller has no, so the buyer has to get a termite inspection and pay for it, unless it's a VA loan. And a VA loan, the seller has to pay for the termite. That's just a weird thing about VA loans. But typically, the buyer will pay for the termite inspection, and within 14 days prior to closing, they have to give that report to the seller. If there is a current active infestation, seller has to mitigate. Current active infestation. That means there are live bugs in the house crawling around eating wood. If there are dead bugs, that is not an active infestation. That is an old infestation that there is no requirement for the seller to mitigate because there's nothing to mitigate. It's not active. What the buyer can do, let's say there were termites in the basement and it was chewing on some of the joists in the basement. You can have a structural inspection done, ordered and paid for by the buyer, have someone come in and evaluate whether or not the structural integrity was compromised from the termites. If it's found that it was, then you get into this part where buyer shall cause a copy of the written report of the inspection for structural defect to be delivered to the seller not less than 7 days prior to closing. So you've got a week's time in here where 14 days prior to closing, you got a report. 7 days prior to closing, you gave the seller proof that there was structural damage. The seller has 2 days to decide if they want to fix it or they want to rescind the contract and let your buyer out. Okay, so they may say, yeah, sorry, the house is collapsing, but we're not fixing it. Your client can have their earnest money back. We're rescinding the contract. Then your client has 1 day to say, okay, I want out, or I'll take the house in as is condition and I understand that the seller's not going to fix anything. So that is the gist of how termites work. Know that the only way the seller is contractually obligated to pay for remediation is if there are live bugs crawling around chewing on wood. Any questions about that? This one gets messy. All right. Radon. Radon, so buyer at buyer's expense can have a radon test. In here is your deadline. Keep it easy for yourself. I would keep the appraisal, the home inspection and the radon deadlines the same. If you can make the appraisal deadline the same, even better. But given how hard it is to schedule inspections right now, that might not be possible, but there are a lot of home inspectors that also do radon. So if you keep them on the same deadline, everybody's worlds are a little bit easier. So I would make this the same ideas as appraisals at least 3 weeks after the contract is written. So if we sign today, I would go 3 weeks from today at minimum, up to 1 week before closing. As you write contracts, you'll kind of get a feel for how far out home inspectors are booking. And you may get, some people may negotiate on these. They may say, hey, we want this deadline bumped up, you know, so it's, everything is negotiable, but that's what I would use as a general rule of thumb. At least 3 weeks from the time you sign the contract, and then no more than a week before closing. I'm sorry, no less than a week before closing. So this says that the buyer can pay for a radon test. If the radon level is measured at 4 picocuries per liter of air or higher, so when you explain this to your buyer client, I keep radon really simple. Radon is the gas emitted from the soil from decaying matter. There's decaying matter in the soil all the time. It's just a matter of how much of that gas is coming up into your house. So crawl spaces with dirt floors tend to be high in radon. Different areas of central Illinois have higher radon levels based on what's in the soil. So it's not always something that you can control, but it is something as a buyer, if this is a 5-year house from you, 5 years from now, you're probably going to have to mitigate. So I would go ahead and write it up in the contract now in most markets. We are in a seller's market. So there's a chance that you, in order to get an offer, you're going to have to waive radon. I wouldn't say it like that. I would just say, the more contingencies we put in a contract, the less aggressive our offer is. So it's up to you whether you want to test for radon or not. But the more things we ask the seller to do, the less competitive our offer is. So you need to be comfortable with waiving any inspections. This is one the seller may not want to do. I can write it in, or we can waive it. If they decide to write it in, you'll put the date in here. And then if radon is high, this is one thing that will change in the contract. It says if the radon level is measured at 4 picocuries per liter of air or higher, it's going to say an average of 4. So when you get a radon report back, it's going to have this big number. It's going to say like 3.8, which means it passes. But you're also going to get this hourly report where it says every hour the radon machine took a reading. And sometimes in an hour, it may spike and go to 4.2. Technically, by our contract, they would have to mitigate. Even though the average says 3.8, our contract doesn't read that way. So if it spiked over 4.0 in one single reading during that window, they could have to mitigate. So it has happened twice in our office where a Chicago agent came down and was doing business in our market, and our seller had to mitigate even though the average was below 4. It spiked once and they had to mitigate. So general rule of thumb, it's that average number. So the seller has one of the following options within 7 days of getting the notice from the buyer that it's high. They can either treat it, give a credit, or rescind the contract. So the seller is not obligated to mitigate radon. They decide if they want to treat it, if they want to give the buyer a credit. Sometimes they'll split it. Or they can say, yeah, we're not fixing it. So either accept it in as-is condition or rescind the contract and the buyer gets the earnest money back. So this just goes through your timing deadlines of how everybody responds. Same idea with your termite provision up here. Just read through this and make sure you understand all of these deadlines. It basically just says once the seller gives the buyer notice of what they want to do, then the buyer has to say within 4 days what they want to do. And so it's just timelines of that back and forth negotiation. So just make sure you understand that part. Equipment. This is your home inspection part. So I would read through part of this with your buyer client every time you sell a house. The parts I would go through with them are the part that's capitalized here. If the inspection discloses any toxic mold, I'll get into that in a second, toxic hazardous waste or defects with heating, air conditioning, electrical, plumbing, or remaining appliances, roofs, structural components, wells, or septic, then you may ask for repairs. These are the things that are valid to ask for in a home inspection. Scratches on hardwood floors, grout popping, nail pops in drywall. Those are not contractual defects. So the seller does not have to go back and fix the wall. Their kids could have colored all over the walls. That does not compromise the integrity of the house. And that is something that you see at the time you write the offer. So there are some things we're clarifying in here, like window seals and some things that are just a nightmare. But for the most part, if it's something that let's say this will happen sometimes where somebody did a DIY project, and let's say they didn't put any baseboards back in the living room. That is not something that you can ask for at the time of the home inspection. If your client wants baseboards put back into the living room, you have to ask for it at the time you're writing the offer right now. So the biggest issues that agents have are when in a normal market, when home inspections are happening and we actually negotiate repairs, that you'll argue about that was visible at the time of the inspection. Think about a crack in a concrete driveway. If the crack is, if anybody knows this, speak up. I think it's like a quarter of an inch or a half an inch. It's a tripping hazard. So if there's a crack in the driveway that your client decides during the inspection they don't like, that was visible at the time they wrote the contract, so you can't ask for it. You might be able to get off if the home inspector says it's a tripping hazard because it's such a big crack. I had a deal like that a couple of years ago where it was such a big issue that it was a tripping hazard, and so we ended up being able to ask for repair. But there's just a lot of gray area in that where you're not going to be able to always cover all your bases. There's just home inspections just bring up these random things. A common one is that like a bathroom fan vents into the attic, and then there's moisture up there. Be very careful when you use the M word, mold. In order for it to be called mold, we have to have a mold test. So your inspection deadline that you put in here is also your deadline for any other inspections you need after that. So let's say I write a contract today and I set my inspection deadline for May 25th. I would get my home inspection done as fast as you can because you may need a roofing inspection, you may need a mold inspection, you may need an electrical inspection, you may need additional inspections done because your home inspection is going to say, recommend a licensed contractor to evaluate. So then you're going to have to get a licensed electrician or a licensed roofer or somebody else out there. That all has to happen before this deadline. So give yourself enough time to make sure that you can get all of that done. But a mold specifically, you cannot ask to mitigate mold if you haven't done a mold test. And your home inspector will not do a mold test. You're going to have to call in a testing company. You can't ask to mitigate mold just because there's some stuff growing on some of the framing in the basement or something. I also read this part to them. Minor repairs and routine maintenance items do not constitute defects under this contract. The fact that a functioning major component may be at the end of its useful life shall not render such component defective for purposes of this contract. It's likely that your home inspector is going to say, maintenance item, furnace is 20 years old, but you suggest routine maintenance or suggest yearly maintenance. I'm still teaching. If that's the case, then about 20 minutes and then you can have it. Okay, I gotta go back down. So if the home inspector notes in there that the furnace is old or at the end of its life, but it's still working, your client's likely going to be like, oh my gosh, I didn't know the furnace was so old. Well, let's ask them to put in a new furnace. Not contractual. If it's working, it can look like the biggest pile of garbage, but if it's working, the seller does not have to fix anything because there's nothing to fix. It's functioning. So make sure that your clients understand that. I would check the age of the mechanicals when you see the house. If you know they're going to write an offer, go look at the age of the furnace, the age of the AC, the water heater, if there's a water softener, any of that stuff, so that they know how old it is. This also explains routine maintenance items could include, where is it? Filter changes, painting, caulking, sealing, door hardware. These are just good things to point out to them so they start thinking about what is a routine maintenance item and what is actually contractual. This is another thing that's probably going to change. I think we're going to allow you to write in what you want this aggregate to be instead of forcing it to be $1,000, because what's happening right now is agents just cross it out and write $5,000 or something to make a stronger offer. So we might as well just let them write whatever they want in there. But if you leave it as it is, then all of your repair items have to total $1,000. And every agent's question to me is, well, how do I know how much all these things cost? Because up here, we talked about how you needed to get all of your estimates and inspections done before that deadline. So if you have electrical issues, you're going to have to get a bid on it. You're going to have to send your report to the electrician. The electrician will probably want to go out there, maybe not, but probably, and then they'll give you a bid. If you are turning in an inspection request, technically we should also know what those items are going to cost. Then it's up to the seller to say, no, I could get it done cheaper. But to get all your ducks in a row, have your estimates and have all of that done at the time you submit your repair request, because then there's something more tangible for the seller to go off of. You cannot request anything that was disclosed in the residential real property form. So let's say in the property disclosures that you have signed with the offer, they note that the basement gets water in the southwest corner. You cannot ask them to fix the southwest corner of the basement because it was already disclosed. So make sure you're looking at those disclosures. Don't ever, 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 never, ever write an offer on a house without looking at the disclosures, ever. There's never a circumstance where that's a good idea, because you're the one on the hook if you didn't get that form signed by your client. That's negligence on your part, and our E&O will not cover you. All right, next, this goes through the timing of how you make those requests, how much time the other side has. So make sure you read through that. I want to keep moving just for sake of time. Home protection plan. This is your home warranty. If you are requesting a home warranty, this says seller shall provide buyer a credit at closing for the cost of a 1-year home protection plan. One gray area in this home warranty clause. This doesn't say who's ordering it. I can't tell you how many times we get to the closing table and it's like, oh shoot, nobody ordered the home inspection. Or the day before closing and somebody's scrambling to get the home warranty, or I'm sorry, home warranty, not home inspection. Getting the home warranty ordered. So make sure you communicate to the other agent who's ordering it. But there's a few different home warranty companies. If you need any more information on those, let me know. I'm not going to go into that here, but you'll put the home warranty company, the coverage, and they all have plan names, so it's easy to pick that. And then the cost is not to exceed. If they're not doing a home warranty, you will write NA in this blank. Don't leave this whole thing blank, because somebody could go in and fill it in later, and then you're on the hook for a home warranty. So if you don't want one, put NA in here, NA in here, and $0 in there. Lead-based paint. I've been doing this is my 11th year in real estate. I've seen 2 lead-based paint inspections, or lead-based paint tests. Really, nobody does them unless they think their kids are going to be chewing on the walls. Sometimes you just get an odd client that had a bad experience. Somebody's cousin's brother's neighbor's aunt had a bad experience with lead-based paint. And so in the 2 circumstances I've seen them be tested, that was the case. Somebody just had a sensitivity to lead-based paint. So most of the time, the improvements were built after 1977, and there just is no risk of lead-based paint. But if they were built before 1978, then they have to say that they either are waiving it or that they are going to have one, and here's their deadline. I think there's only one lead-based paint testing company in Central Illinois. That's how rare it is. And it's expensive to test for. I think the last one was like $450, I think, to test for it. Mitigating it is insanely expensive. So most of the time people don't do it. And I usually tell them just that. If you're concerned that your kids or your animals are going to chew on the walls, or someone is going to get this lead-based paint in their mouth and you want to test for it, then we absolutely can. If that's not a concern to you, you probably don't need to test for it. Seller's warranties. The seller has to sign off on this contract stating that there are no mechanics liens on the property. This means they put new windows in 2 years ago and they never paid the window bill and now there's a lien on the property. If that's the case, it's going to come up in title work and they're going to have to satisfy that lien. You are not responsible for finding liens on the property, but every time I would look at the title work, put your eyes on it. There's a lien section in there where you'll see the mortgage and you'll see any other liens on the property. Make sure you look at that on every transaction because sometimes title companies are human too. Sometimes they miss things. So the seller will have to satisfy any mechanics liens. And then in additional provisions, this is kind of just clean up contractual things. If they put anything into this contract that implied masculine or feminine gender, they apologize. Time is of the essence. Everybody is subject to smoke detector and carbon monoxide detector acts. This is important. If any deadline on this contract falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legally recognized holiday in the state of Illinois, it will be extended to the next business day. Sometimes we just get going a little too fast and we put a closing date on a Sunday. Title companies aren't open on Sunday, so it will automatically bump your closing date to Monday. If Monday is Martin Luther King Day, it's going to bump it to Tuesday. Electronic signatures, this just states that electronic signatures are allowed in the contract. When a couple pages ago, when we were talking about what happens if there's no trim in the living room and your client needs to write, you need to write in that you want the seller to put the baseboards back in the living room because that is aesthetics, that is cosmetic, that is not going to come up in an inspection report. It's visible at the time you write the contract. This is where you would write that in on J. You would say, seller to install baseboards in living room to match the remainder of the house. Be very careful as you're writing things into this blank that you are incredibly clear about what you're asking. If you just say seller to reinstall baseboards, they could put baseboards in that look like cheap plastic because you didn't add, and maybe the rest of the house has beautiful 5-inch baseboards. So you have to make sure that you're really clear if you're asking something in this. If there is ever any doubt, have an attorney help you with the verbiage. But don't be afraid to write something in here. There is an attorney review period that we're going to get to in a second. But just make sure that there is absolutely no way to mistake what you're asking.
Megan, I got a question. And I should probably already know this, but like what you said about the southwest corner in the basement on a disclosure, if they see that, so you're saying we can't ask in inspection times because they already disclosed it. Is there any time, do you just have to take that as is, or is that something that you can put here in this area as well?
You could put it in here, but they're likely, if they put it on the disclosure, they're not going to fix it. You can ask for anything at the time of the offer. So you could say, that seller to cover up to $2,000 in foundation repairs for southwest corner of the basement or something. But it's likely that because they're putting it in the disclosure and they didn't care enough to fix it while they live there, that they're probably not going to fix it before closing.
Okay, thank you.
There's no shame in asking. Worst case scenario, they say no. You just have to be careful in this market, especially in this market, you want to write a clean offer. The cleaner the offer, the less contingencies, the more likely your client is to get it. The more you ask for when they start looking at closing costs and repairing the basement and a home warranty, and they start adding those things up, they're just like, this offer's clean, let's just write it up there. So sometimes it's better to just tell your client, like, hey, if you think there's a couple $1,000s worth of problems in the basement, then let's just offer a couple $1,000 less and you take care of it outside of closing. You can go either way, but sometimes in this market right now, the cleaner the offer, the better. Escrow-E, this is kind of redundant. It's the same as the first page. So the parties agree that this brokerage or title company is the escrow-E, which means they're holding the escrow money. One thing that I failed to explain the last time I did this class was escrow and earnest money are the same thing. Earnest money is held in an escrow account and often called escrow money. They are the same thing. It is the good faith money that the buyer puts down saying, I want to buy this house on this date for this amount of money with all of these things, all of these factors that we're writing in included. So if the buyer defaults and the buyer walks away from the contract or doesn't hold up their end, they forfeit that earnest money or escrow money. If they walk away in accordance with the contract, meaning that they walk away because we can't come to terms on repairs or their financing has a problem, they can get that escrow money back. But escrow and earnest money are the same thing, so you'll hear them called both. Additional conditions, I've never needed this blank. I don't really even know why it's here. Just put NA in here because we don't leave blanks on contracts. Attorney review. Within 5 business days of the date of acceptance, both parties have the option to have an attorney review the contract. One of the things that we're talking to IR Legal about right now is we've gotten ourselves into the habit in Bloomington, like I said, of saying the seller has to hire an attorney. That is technically a violation of our code of ethics because they do not legally have to hire an attorney. I think we get away with it in Bloomington because it's the overwhelming majority of people say it that way, and thankfully the public doesn't know any different. But they're starting to get smarter because they've bought and sold houses in different markets, and online research is pretty easy to do. And all of the markets around us, other than Chicago, don't use attorneys the way that we do. So Peoria doesn't use attorneys, Springfield doesn't use attorneys, Champaign is starting to get away from attorneys. So we're kind of being surrounded by markets that don't use them. So just be careful with the way you say to sellers that they have to have an attorney. I would say it as, this is how an attorney helps you. I am not an attorney. So if there's anything that needs drawn up throughout the contract, or there is something that gets into the legal language of the contract, or the buyer just gets a wild hair and does something crazy, I would have to hand it over to an attorney anyway. So if you would like to have an attorney, you can have one now. Otherwise, they can bring in an attorney at any time. We love to say that if you don't get an attorney at within this 5-day period, you don't get to have one. Well, you don't get to have one just to review the contract. However, if the seller or the buyer don't get an attorney and the other side of the transaction is in breach of contract and the attorneys are going to have to fight about escrow money, we have to bring an attorney in at that point because we're not allowed to do that. We are not an attorney, so we can't practice law. So we're going to clean that language up a little bit when we redo the contract, but my advice is just to be very careful that you're not telling your client they have to have an attorney. We have probably, I would say, maybe 5 to 7 agents in the office whose sellers are not really using attorneys. So we're going to see a little bit more of that. I'll be honest, as a managing broker, I love having attorneys involved. It gives me a little bit of extra peace of mind. But we have 20 agents that operate in Peoria that never use attorneys, and I have just as many problems in Bloomington as I do in Peoria. So I can't tell you that attorneys keep us out of trouble completely. If you have trouble, you're just going to have it, and then an attorney is going to have to step in if they're going to have to step in. So just be careful with the way you talk through that. But in general, buyers and sellers have 5 days from the date the contract is signed to have an attorney review it and say, yes, I like it, or no, I want these changes. And they have to initial saying that they understand that. And it says, if written notice is not served within the time specified, the provisions of this paragraph shall be deemed waived by the parties and the contract shall remain in full force and effect. So that just means that the attorney can't come in on day 6 and say, hey, I don't like the way this is written, let's clean it up to this. They've lost that ability. However, if a party defaults on the contract and it needs to be handed over to attorneys, they can still bring one in at that point. Any questions on attorneys? This is going to be a moving target in the next few years because we're going to see some changes. But I will never push you to use or not use an attorney. You have to do what your client feels comfortable with. Settlement. Settlement will be held at a location agreed upon. Typically, closing is at the title company or the lender's office. Seller's disclosure. So this is just saying that the seller has to provide residential real property disclosure, radon, and lead-based paint if it's applicable. Attorney fees and expenses have to be paid. The attorneys have just thrown this in to say, hey, we need to make sure that we get paid for any services rendered. So that is in here. If either party should breach this contract, the other party may pursue any and all remedies provided. This is line 24 is what allows your client to bring in an attorney down the road if they need to. So if seller breaches the contract, buyer can pursue any and all remedies, meaning hire an attorney at that time. Entire agreement. This just states that this is the entire contract. There's not any other contract. It's just this one. This just gives the updated form information. Mortgage authorization. This is the seller giving permission to the title company to get their mortgage payoff. There will be a separate form that'll come to them from the title company that they'll sign that says that their mortgage information, their mortgage holder, mortgage number, and all that. Confirmation and consent to dual agency. Never, ever, ever, never, ever leave this blank. I had 2 issues of dual agency in the last 2 years, and in one of them, this was not filled out. If you are acting as a dual agent, they need to sign dual agency in their listing contract or buyer rep agreement that are signed prior to this offer. So they've agreed to dual agency before they found the house or before they got an offer on their listing. They're agreeing to it again at the time of the contract signing. In the state of Illinois, we have to agree to dual agency twice. So if you only got it on the listing contract or your buyer agency agreement and you don't get it on this contract, we're in trouble. And in the one that I had, we wrote a $7,000 check to make it go away. So fill out your dual agency. If you are not acting as a dual agent, that's why NA is here. But just get in the habit of filling that out every time. So if it's not your listing, no problem, NA. If it is your listing, then they have to say yes to dual agency, and they better be able to regurgitate to me what they signed. The second one instance, it was not filled out. The second instance I had, they're like, my agent filled that out. It was just dot looped over to me. I didn't even know what I was signing. So I didn't understand that that was dual agency, and I didn't agree to that. And now what? So make sure that you are going through this with them and they understand dual agency, especially this day and age. I mean, we get so fast in writing offers that we're just sending them over and sign and get it submitted, and make sure you're slowing down enough to make sure they understand. If you are part of a team, let's see, MJ's on the call. I'll pick on him. MJ's on a team. If MJ brings the buyer to Jackson's listing, they're on the same team. That is dual agency. So they both have to have dual agency signed because one person on the team has a financial interest in both sides. And there's always a question of whether confidentiality can be kept. All teams operate differently. Sometimes they don't share information. Sometimes they sit down and have meetings once a week and go through all their listings and what their sellers need. And so sometimes there's personal information that's shared. So to stay on the up and up, we just have to have dual agency signed if it's within a team as well. And then everybody signs and dates. The escrowee, if escrow is being held at Keller Williams, you will sign here. If escrow is being held by the listing agent will sign here. You are all authorized as agents of Keller Williams to sign as the escrowee. And that's our one step.
And that does need to be signed, right? I feel like people like to leave that out.
They do. I failed an audit. So I've been audited by IDFPR twice. They're absolutely terrible. And I get contracts kicked back for not signing escrowee. So as escrowee. So you do have to sign, just acknowledging that you are accepting escrow as part of Keller Williams. So the only time I don't get in trouble for it is if I'm not the escrowee and the Coldwell Banker agent forgets to sign it. That's not on me. That's on them. So if you can get it signed by the other side, try to. But if you can't, know that if it's not your signature missing or a Keller Williams signature missing, Liz, if you have a transaction with Marjorie, then yes, we have to have it signed because it's a Keller Williams to Keller Williams transaction. But if it's a Coldwell Banker agent or a Remax agent or whatever, and they don't sign it, there's no liability in that for us. So that's okay.
Okay, that's good to know.
So Megan, I have a question. The listing that I did, we are holding the earnest check, but I didn't sign that. So do I need to sign it, and do I need to send, or just like before uploading the documents, I can sign it and I can upload?
Yeah, before you upload it, just sign it.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions on the contract? Anything you've always wondered that you want to pick my brain about? Nope. All right. Well, then that's everything I have. Like I said, there will be some contract changes coming in the next 90-ish days. There is also, I'm not going to cover it in this class, but I want you all to know, I'm probably going to mention them in team meeting tomorrow just because we haven't talked about them in a little while. But in the last 60 days, the contracts committee came out with a change form and an inspection addendum. So if you have not started using those, the change form is great. If you have to request an extension of one of those deadlines that we went through, it's a really easy way to just say appraisal deadline, changing it to this date, everybody sign. Sometimes names get spelled wrong, or we need to move a closing date or move a purchase price, or it's just a really clean document to make any changes to the blanks in the contract so that you're not crossing out and initialing and trying to figure out what the latest version is. So that change form is in .loop and DocuSign. And then the repair addendum is a really clean way to request any of those inspection items that we talked about when you're going to request repairs. You can list out the page number of the inspection report, what the repair item is. It just keeps everything cleaner. If we don't use those forms, or at least the repair form, we're just doing it by email. And sometimes things get lost in translation. So it's just a nice, like, clean 1-page document, 2-page document, where you can sign off and say this is exactly what repairs are being done. So if you haven't started using those, make sure you go through those. And if you need any help with them when the time comes, let me know. But
Megan, I do have a question. On the contract, so if my buyer has flexibility to close whenever, and we're submitting an offer, is that something that we can put seller to decide in that blank, or what do you, okay.
yeah, so if you want, up here, in here, you can put seller to decide right here if you want. The other thing you can do is just call the listing agent and say, hey, my buyers are totally flexible. What do your clients want for a closing date? And they may just tell you. And it may be better to know that date and just put it in. But when they counter, if you do just put seller to decide, when they counter, then I would just make sure that you have that date and you don't leave it totally open-ended.
So if we were to put seller to decide, if we didn't get that date from the agent, then all the other dates in there, do you put like 2 weeks before closing, or okay.
That's why, just to make it a little bit easier for yourself, I would just call the listing agent and say, hey, my buyers will give your sellers whatever closing date they want. Do you have any idea what they want? And you could always put a date in there and then put a note up here that says seller to decide. Okay. And so you've got a date in there, but if the seller decides they want something different after they're reviewing offers, but then at least you've got a date to set everything else by.
Okay.
Megan, the change form that you're talking about, like where we can change the dates, I was trying to find it out because I need it for today, but like I was not able to find it in .loop as well as in DocuSign. I found the old one, but not the new one. Oh, change.
It's residential sales contract change addendum in the MIRA folder.
Okay. So I think maybe I was only looking for the change and I was not able to find it. Okay.
If you have any trouble with this, let me know. But yeah, this goes through. This is where you'll put the the street address in here, and then let's say the property address was typed in wrong or the name of the buyer or seller. This is to change your loan commitment date,
The
appraisal date.
appraisal date, yes. So here in this scenario, Megan, like the appraisal date that I have given is like this weekend, and I have given the financing contingency on that date. But because the buyer took a lot of time to submit all the documents, we need to postpone the date to next week, the appraisal date. So in that scenario, do you suggest me to go ahead and change the financial contingency, or we cannot do it?
Yeah, you can
Okay.
change both. If
Okay.
it's going to affect your financing contingency too, I would just
Mhm.
I would do this
Mhm.
and the
Yep.
and the financing contingency.
Contingency. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
this document's awesome just to clean up any of those things. And then the repair, since I've got it open, the residential sales contract inspection repair addendum. This is where I was saying, like, you can go reference the item and page number of the inspection report and then write in what you want done. It's broken down only into the things that are contractual. So, like, if you have a client that just keeps asking and asking for things like, I want this repainted, I want this drywall fixed, I want whatever. This is nice because you can just say, like, there's nowhere for me to write that in. Like, that's not contractual. I can't even write that anywhere. And maybe that'll help you kind of deal with their expectations. And then if you have any additional inspections, if you did a fireplace inspection or a mold inspection, you can reference those inspection reports here. But this form will clean up a lot of like the issues that we've had with gray areas around repairs. If they're just doing a credit, so say they want all of these things, but they just want a credit for it, you can explain that in here and just say yes to the repair credit option and say in lieu of additional repairs, they're asking for a credit for the cost of repairs at settlement as follows. And you can say page 6, item number 7, GFCI outlets requesting $300 credit or something. So however you want to do that so that they don't have to have contractors in and out of the house, or maybe you're on a tight deadline. So, and then everybody signs off on it. So, all right. Any other questions? All
No,
right.
thank you.
You're all well versed on the one-step contract. You'll hear this called the sales contract and the one-step. The reason it's called the one-step is we used to have that purchase agreement I was talking about that we use on new construction, and then the attorneys would draw up a formal contract. So it was a two-step process. So some of us still call this the one-step because we don't have to have a formal contract drawn up. This is our contract. So if you ever hear somebody refer to the one-step, it's just our residential sales contract that we went over today. So anything else, just let me know.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Guys, have a good day. See ya.